Let's journey far and back in time, ride sun ships on the shores of Mars, then to future galaxies, aspiring.
All right, howdy Ags. Hope you guys are doing well. Hope everybody's staying safe, etc. And settling into a summer of biomechanics. So we're at the point where we're getting into kind of what I consider the meat of how people move and the analysis that we do in terms of working with performance, enhancing performance, try to keep people safe, prevention, as well as thinking about principles relating to rehabilitation, as well as orthopedics. So this is an exciting part here. This is kind of what I call the secret of human movement. So keep it quiet. Don't tell anybody, because this is your advantage. Your advantage is understanding that the way people move and manipulate different instruments, tools, rackets, bicycles, etc., to be able to enhance performance in sports, in everyday activity, exercising for health, which is incredibly important. So I was looking at some articles recently that demonstrated that exercise actually reduces the risk of getting really sick with COVID-19. That's incredibly important. It enhances some special antioxidant enzymes. There's a special type of superoxide dismutase that it elevates, which protects blood vessels in the lungs, the heart, maybe even the brain, but certainly reduces the risk. Also, one of the same antioxidant enzymes is actually released by skeletal muscle during exercise, which can reduce, again, COVID-19 risk, but also reduces cancer risk as well. So one of the things we're discovering is that when people exercise, your skeletal muscles actually release a lot of really small chemicals and proteins. So everything from this superoxide dismutase protein, which is actually pretty large, to something called microRNA, which sounds a little bit like a virus. It's small, but in this case, the microRNA can help to regulate metabolism, can reduce chronic disease risk. Some of them are pro-inflammatory and help with the healing process. But the point is that when people are exercising, your muscles themselves release compounds that can actually reduce risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, possibly Alzheimer's, etc. So a lot of the chronic diseases that we really worry about. So that's really good news. And exercise also enhances the ability of the immune system to be able to handle things like COVID-19. So if you can socially distance, get outside. Yeah, I know it's July, it's hot out there, but if you can get outside or in a socially distanced place inside, maybe even your own home, and you can exercise, it's going to make a big difference. So get those workouts in. So part of the secret of human movement, the central part, is the ability of muscles to use are the three different lever systems to be able to generate torque, to be able to cause joints to rotate, to be able to produce force and power either on the ground or on a baseball or softball, whatever it happens to be. So our purpose today, or at least with this lecture, which will still be relatively short, is to go over the major lever systems. What are the advantages and disadvantages of each, where we find these in the body, where we find these in real life world applications. So it's going to be all about levers. So a lever is a rigid bar-like body that can rotate about an axis. So as you might imagine, this pertains to a lot of our muscle joint systems in the body. So muscles tug on like the ulna, causing it to rotate around the elbow. At the knee joint, we have the femur and the tibia rotating around their articulation. At the shoulder joint, put my models together, there we go. We can have rotation upward, the shoulder girdle rotates upward, and so does the humerus when we're producing abduction of the shoulder. So at our major joints, we've got movement through lever systems. So what are lever systems? They have a fulcrum, they have an axis of rotation. It could be a joint in a body, could be a body segment, could be basically our hands on the handle of a racket or a bat or a golf club, etc. There's usually some motive force on one side of the fulcrum, which is separated from the fulcrum by a distance we call the force arm. That's actually what we call a lever arm. It's a lever distance. The longer that force arm is, the greater the leverage. Since torque is a combination, as we talked about last time, a product of force times how far the force is being exerted off center, the longer the force arm is, the greater the amount of torque that this motive force can produce. So to enhance torque production by a lever, we can increase the magnitude of the force, increase the length of the force arm, or some combination thereof. One of the things to keep in mind is to maximize torque, that force should be perpendicular to the lever, ideally. And when we resolve a muscle force vector or another force vector, the part that produces the rotary component that produces torque is always drawn perpendicular to the lever system. We also have a resistance. It isn't always on the other side. This is with a first-class lever, this example right here, like a seesaw. And there's resistance, which is also a force, is exerted at some distance away from the fulcrum. Okay, so that's a preview into the first type of lever system we'll talk about, first class. So they have simple names, first class, second class, and third class. So the first class lever system, we have the fulcrum in the middle. So in this person doing some rowing, here's the axis of rotation, here's the motive force. The resistance is basically the paddle or oar in the water. So we have a resistance arm, we have a fulcrum in the middle, and we have an applied force. With a first class lever, you're going to see the applied force and the resistance, for the most part, having the direction of that force vector roughly the same, pointing downward or upward or to the side. They may not be exactly the same, but relatively they're the same. So even though the forces are pointing or pulling or pushing in the same direction, they're going to create torque in the opposite direction. As we're looking at this applied force and its force arm, the torque is going to be, as we're looking at it, clockwise. With the resistance arm, the torque is going to be counterclockwise. If we had the same magnitude, resistance, and applied force, and the length of the force arm and resistance arm were exactly the same, we'd have a balanced lever system. And because we have torques that are going in the opposite direction, that are equal in magnitude, we have a net torque of 0. So this goes back to the principle of moments that we finished up with last time. We just have to keep in mind that the net torque is simply the sum of all of the individual torques. It could be body segments, it could be an impact force on a tennis racket or a softball bat. It could be the weight of a person. So there are lots of factors that can potentially, or forces that can potentially cause torque. And based on where they are related to the axis of rotation, they can produce torque in one direction, like clockwise, and then a force on the other side is going to produce torque in the opposite direction. So remember, this is just with a first-class lever that the forces are in the same direction, torques are in the opposite direction. The axis of rotation is somewhere in the middle. Now, it doesn't have to be exactly in the middle. So in other words, the length of the force arm doesn't always have to be equal to the length of the resistance arm. If the length of the force arm is greater, the longer that is, the greater the amount of leverage. So for an applied force, we can move a larger resistance. This is what we call a mechanical advantage. We can maximize torque production by that applied force. If we have a small resistance arm, we're actually reducing the torque and leverage that the resistance is producing. So we have a number of tools that sometimes can take advantage of this with a first-class lever, like a pair of pliers, has a fairly long force arm. Here's the pin in the middle, the fulcrum, and then a small resistance arm. So that's ideal in terms of producing torque. A crowbar is fairly similar. You have a very long force arm. This is where your hand is pushing or pulling up, pushing down or pulling up on the crowbar. And then you have an axis of rotation. A good crowbar creates its own axis of rotation. And that allows you to be able to pull something or move an object, or in this case, kind of a rusty nail out of a board that ordinarily would be extremely difficult. We take advantage of a first-class lever system with a long force arm and a small resistance arm. The greater you can make the ratio of the force arm divided by the resistance arm, the more, in a sense, oomph you'll have. Okay, so let's say we have two folks on a seesaw. So we're going to call this person Brad. And let's say Brad is sitting at the end of the seesaw. So his weight is a long way from the axis of rotation. So let's say Angela decides, you know what, the seesaw is tilting in that direction. Maybe what I'm going to do is move behind this bar. So I'm going to maximize my force arm. And when you can do that, that enhances the amount of torque. So she's going to climb back here, and then the seesaw may tilt the other way as the net torque basically reverses itself. So again, first-class levers, lots of examples. Scissors are a great example of a first-class lever. In an adult pair of scissors, you have long shears. So the resistance is actually a fair distance away from the axis of rotation. That's the pin in the middle. Here's the force that we're producing. So we have a situation that's more like this, where the resistance arm is greater than the force arm. So you can't produce as much torque, and you can't overcome as large a resistance. So if you're going to cut sheet metal, this is probably not the kind of thing that you want to do. You want to use a pair of shears and try to cut it much closer to the axis of rotation or pin. But the trade-off, the good thing is that against the light resistance, like a piece of paper, this is going to cut pretty fast and you can go pretty far. This is the kind of blunt scissors a child might use. They're, of course, safer because they don't have those very narrow points that could, poke an eye out or cause some damage, puncture the skin, etc. But the disadvantage is, or the advantage is that you have a large force arm and a much smaller resistance arm. So that means that often with children, their hands are weaker, or the muscles that move their thumb and fingers are weaker. So that means that they can produce more torque with a smaller amount of force and overcome, like if they've got poster board or cardboard to cut, that's going to make the job a little easier. So again, with the first class lever, we can increase the force arm, decrease it, increase or decrease the moment arm. So the trade-off is torque that you can produce, maximizing torque with a large force arm and a small resistance arm versus a larger range of motion, increased speed, increased accuracy. That's what happens when you have a larger resistance arm and a smaller force arm. There you can only overcome a small resistance, so the assumption is you don't need as much torque development. So there's the trade-off. So I mentioned that when you have the fulcrum in the middle and two forces, if the forces are pointing in the same direction, you probably have a first-class lever. However, if you have the fulcrum in the middle and the forces are pointing in the opposite direction, and this may be a little counterintuitive at first, you no longer have a true first-class lever. You have a force, or I call it a torque couple, meaning that we're going to double, we're going to maximize the amount of torque. When your hands are on a steering wheel in the car and you have to move it fast, that's exactly what you have, is you have a force on one side pulling down, you have a force on the other side of that wheel pulling up. Both of them are producing torque, as you guys are looking at it, in the same direction. In the case of our model here, it's a counterclockwise direction. So golfers use a force couple between their left and their right hand when they're golfing. That's kind of the last axis of rotation as they're moving through the kinematic chain during the swing. So ideally, you should have the trunk or torso, then the shoulders moving, and finally this movement around basically the handle, or we call it the wrist, but really between the hands. So the fulcrum is the axis of rotation is between the hands. You got one hand on one side, one hand on the other side. Dancers, when they're doing a pirouette, will often use a force couple. In our own body, we have a few examples of a force couple. Shoulder abduction is kind of an example of a force couple. In this case, we have the shoulder right here. If we're going to do shoulder abduction, we're going to move, as you guys are looking at it, we would move in a clockwise direction. So the deltoid muscle and the rotator cuff, specifically, we're mostly talking about the supraspinatus here, they're going to be tugging on either side of the axis of rotation, which is the glenohumeral joint, or what we normally call the shoulder joint. So the deltoid pulls up in one direction, supraspinatus pulls down in the other direction, but they're both producing torque in the same direction. As we're looking at this, they would both produce torque in the clockwise direction. So this is, again, a classic example of a force or a torque couple, where you have forces on either side. They're pointing in the opposite direction, but they're maximizing torque. So again, a golfer, really good example with the golf swing and producing, maximizing the amount of torque. So there's the force or torque couple right there. And this is, again, the last thing that happens. We've got trunk rotation first, then shoulder rotation, and finally movement around the hands as we try to maximize the club head speed. So for Rory McIlroy, if he can, hit 115, 120, 125, he's probably just north of 125 miles per hour in terms of club head speed. And that's going to produce a ball speed of 185, 190. He was one of the longer drivers in the tour a few years ago. Now I think Brian DeChambeau is probably number one in terms of driving distance, as he's reformed his body to maximize force and power. Okay, second class levers. This is the next lever system we're going to talk about. Now we've got the fulcrum on one side, we have the resistance now in the middle, and the force on the other side. So what this means is that the force arm is always going to be greater than the resistance arm. Okay, so the trade-off here is we're maximizing force production by an applied force so that we can overcome a very large resistance. So for example, with a wheelbarrow, you can produce 100 pounds of lifting force at the handles and maybe lift 200 to 300 pounds of rocks, sand, stone, etc., whatever the load happens to be. So wheelbarrow is a great example of a second-class lever. The smaller the resistance arm and the greater or the longer the force arm, the greater the leverage you have and the greater the mechanical advantage. That would be the ratio of the force arm divided by the resistance arm. Okay, so we're trying to stay awake here. Hey, Trixie, wake up. There we go. So, oh my gosh, putting to sleep the audience. Well, that's summer days. Yeah, these are definitely the dog days of summer. They unfortunately may last a while here in Texas. So with a wrench set, the resistance arm is the distance between the middle of the bolt and the outside. So it's really super small. And the force arm would be the length of the wrench down to where a hand is holding it. So we could be looking at 20, maybe 20 times longer force arm than resistance arm. So let's say that that's the case. If I can produce 50 pounds of force, right, and I multiply that by 20, that's 1,000 pounds. So I can free up a bolt that requires 1,000 pounds. Let's say it's old and rusty, and I might need half a ton of force to move it. It only takes 50 pounds of force on the wrench to do that. Let's say I produce 100 pounds of force. Well, I can probably overcome the amount of force that's holding a bolt together that literally takes 1 ton of force. So tools are great ways of maximizing the force arm, minimizing the resistance arm, maximizing your leverage. But the trade-off is you don't have really fast movements. Like when you're moving, a wheelbarrow, you don't really have to do it very fast. Nutcracker is another good example where you got the effort, the force on one end, you have the fulcrum on the other end, and then the load or resistance right in the middle. Again, that gives you a big advantage. You probably wouldn't be able to crush it with your hand, but you can crush it with this instrument. Having steel here helps a good bit as well. Third class levers. Third class levers have the fulcrum on one side. The force and resistance, they don't have to be on the right side and the fulcrum's on the left side. It could be just the opposite. Doesn't really matter. But the fulcrum's on one side. Now we've got the applied force in the middle, somewhere in the middle. It could be very close to the fulcrum. And we have the resistance on the outside. Now when you take that oar and you use both hands, it goes from a first class lever to a third class lever. Most muscle joint systems are third class lever systems, whether it's shoulder abductors, knee extension, the tibialis anterior in terms of dorsiflexion. Most of these systems that our body is moving using torque are third class levers. Shoulder abduction, as I mentioned a few moments ago, horizontal adduction, extension of the shoulder. Virtually every muscle joint system, with a number of exceptions, is going to be a third class lever. So with the third class lever, the problem is that we've got, we have an applied force in the middle. So that means that force arm could be very small and the resistance arm could be very large. So it's not ideal in terms of maximizing torque. So you would think, well, this really isn't a very effective system in terms of movement. We can't produce a lot of torque. Torque's the way we move. So how can we do better? Well, tools help. It's one of the reasons that humans develop tools. But there are some advantages to third class levers, and we'll show you that here in just a few minutes. Come on. There we go. So some real world examples of all three lever systems. We talked about this just a few moments ago. For the first class levers, seesaws, scissors, and this is kind of like a crowbar situation. So Fred here is having trouble with this rock. So what he can do is he can change the resistance arm and the force arm length by moving this, this piece of wood. So the piece of wood is acting as a fulcrum or an axis of rotation. It's kind of like a stop. If we move it closer to the rock, that reduces the resistance arm and increases the force arm. So right now it looks like we have maybe a 3-to-1 ratio. We could make that 8-to-1 or maybe even 10-to-1 by moving the block closer to the rock. Closer we move it, for a given force, we're going to be able to move a heavier rock. That's the big advantage. Second class levers. Oh, we've got some problems here. This is from, I think, the old Susan Hall text. So hopefully you'll see problems with this person's posture. Maybe they shouldn't be smiling. They should probably be standing with their center of gravity next to the handles. You want to get as close to the handles as possible. So that way you can use hip extension, knee extension, even a little plantar flexion, and have this underneath, the handles underneath your center of gravity and your shoulders. Because right now this is creating a fairly large moment arm or resistance arm on the lower back. And then we don't want to use the term bent over. Then we've got flexion of the hip and spine, so that the spinal angle increases the risk of what we call chopping or shear forces. If the human spine is relatively vertical, then that limits the amount of shear forces acting on it. So he could work on his posture, produce at least the same amount of force, and overcome this resistance, which is closer to the axis of rotation. As I'm looking at it here, let's say we can make it a 3-to-1 ratio. So with 100 pounds of upward force, we can move basically 300 pounds of load, dirt, sand, etc. If you have a flat tire, you're definitely going to want leverage. So the distance between the middle of the bolt and the outside of the bolt, that's the resistance arm. It's really small. And then the distance from the middle of the bolt to the hand, that's the force arm, really large. So we get lots of torque. We do sacrifice some speed and range of motion, but we don't care. We're getting the job done. Same thing is true. You don't need a lot of motion in terms of like breaking like a walnut and eating some pecans because those shells are pretty hard to break. So what you're trying to do is maximize the torque, put the pressure literally on this walnut, break it open, and eat it. With third-class levers, again, with a paddle, what we have is the axis of rotation on top, and they're moving the shaft of the paddle closer to the paddle or oar itself. So here the objective is you might have a fish, nasty fish, a shark behind you. So you better go fast. So the advantage of third-class levers, or one of the advantages, is speed. There's so many problems with this particular image. I'm going to let you guys work through it and think about how their mechanics could be a lot better. Most muscle joint systems in humans are like this: third-class levers, long resistance arm, short force arm. So we're going to go over examples of first, second-class, and third-class lever systems in the body. They're really just a handful of first-class levers. So when people are doing triceps extension exercises, those are examples of a first-class lever. So here's the Okerlund process. The triceps brachii are tugging on one side. As agonist muscles, their job is to extend the elbow. It doesn't mean when you're doing an elbow flexion exercise, when you're extending your elbow and letting the weight down, that the triceps are doing the work. Gravity's doing the work. The biceps brachii, brachialis, and brachioradialis, their job is to slow down the effect of gravity. So this is an eccentric contraction of these muscles when you're letting it down. You don't really need the triceps. In fact, the triceps are contracting. What they're trying to do is produce a co-contraction that helps to stabilize joints and bones. Okay, so we have a situation where we have a fulcrum in the middle. We have the weight on one end of this lever system, and then we have the motive force on the other side. Notice that the forces are in the same direction, but they're on either side of the axis of rotation. So first of all, it means we have a first-class lever. Second of all, it means that the force arm is really short and the resistance arm is really long. So it's difficult to be able to lift a fairly large amount of weight. 20, 25, 30 pounds is a lot for a lot of people when they're doing a tricep extension exercise like that, each dumbbell. If you can lift 25 pounds with each, you're doing pretty well. Neck extension, plantar flexion, there's a couple of other examples we'll use and look at, including agonist and antagonist muscle pairs. Okay, with neck extension, we're using the upper part of the erector spinae complex, which follows the spine all the way down. Its job is to produce extension. We don't want to use the term bending, extension and hyperextension of the spine. The axis of rotation is between the first vertebrae and the cranium, and so that joint is called the atlanto-occipital joint, and it can move all around, can do all kinds of things, but it can do flexion and extension. So in the erector spinae, pull on the back of the skull, back of the cranium. You can see they're producing force in one direction. We have the axis of rotation in the middle, and then the mass of your massive brain is right here. It's on the other side of this first-class lever. So this is a case actually where force arm is a little bigger than the resistance arm. So that means you can move your big head around pretty easily. So good news. Here's something that's really interesting, because some muscle joint systems in some circumstances are one type of lever, and then in other circumstances, they're actually another type of lever. So this is a case where the plantar flexor muscles, gastrocnemius, soleus, plantaris muscle, even though the plantaris muscle in humans is really pretty small. These muscles actually produce ankle rotation and plantar flexion as a first-class lever when you're, let's say, pushing down on the gas pedal. So the gas pedal, due to Newton's third law, will produce a reaction force on one side. The tibio-talar joint, that's the upper ankle joint, if you will, that's a hinge joint where you produce dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. That's in the middle. The plantar flexors tugging on the calcaneus through the Achilles tendon and up to the gastrocnemius, which is the big superficial muscle, and the soleus, which is deep and right next to the tibia, they're producing force on the other side. So it's a classic first-class lever system. Fulcrum's in the middle, motor force on one side, resistance on the other side. Notice in this case, it's a first-class lever system with a short force arm and a long resistance arm. So when you're pushing down on the brake or the gas pedal, or if you have a clutch, most people, when they push on a clutch, will actually use hip extension and knee extension and won't change the angle of their ankle very much, at least once they get used to it. If you haven't driven the stick shift, it does take some practice to get used to. But once you got it, I found you really don't lose it that much. So I used to drive a stick shift for a long time. And then way back in the day, I used to drive some Jeeps around, worked on a farm on and off during some summers. And I found it's a skill. Once you have it, you don't lose it. It's like riding a bicycle. You do have to account when you change vehicles. Sometimes the clutch system's a little different. So there could be an adjustment period as you get used to how stiff the clutch is, but overall it's pretty cool. And once people get used to it, you notice most drivers, like in Europe, for example, and many in Asia, prefer to use instead of automatic automatic drive or automatic transmissions, they tend to use the manual. But it's what you get used to. Anyway, the point is that you're producing a first-class lever, and one with a larger resistance arm, smaller force arm. So you're definitely feeling some resistance. So if you really want to work out those plantar flexors, you actually want to design a machine or exercises that will force you to use first-class levers. And we're going to show you why in just a few moments. Because in other situations, the plantar flexors are going to turn into a second-class lever. And I'll show you that magic trick in just a moment. Another first-class lever system, if you're doing an exercise and you're lifting a leg like this, and you're working out your gluteus medius and gluteus minimus, they are now acting as a first-class lever. So the muscles are basically attaching to the ilium. You have the axis of rotation in the middle, and then you have the center of mass of the leg somewhere probably close to the knee. So you have, it's a first-class lever with a relatively short force arm and a longer resistance arm. So this is a pretty good exercise. And these are muscles that a lot of times when people are working out, we forget to really emphasize and isolate. And these are the two muscles that are the only things between you and the ground. Every time your foot is in the stance phase and the other one's in the swing phase, whether you're walking or running, that's the only thing between you and the ground, these two muscles. If they're not contracting, off you go. So when they're abducted like this, we've got a first-class lever. However, when your feet are on the ground and you're pushing off, they turn into a third-class lever. They still have a relatively small force arm, but they do act like a third-class lever then. Okay, Other examples of first-class levers, not too many more individual muscle joint groups, but every single agonist, antagonist muscle pair that can act in co-contraction. These are first-class levers where we have let's say the agonist muscles producing torque in one direction, antagonist muscles are producing torque in the opposite direction. So with a co-contraction, we're having both muscles tugging at the same time, pushing the two bones in the articulating joint together. That's again reducing the chance of a shear force. So again, you can do the simple exercise that we've done before. Press your hands really just lightly together in that rub. Really easy. That's shear force right there. Really easy to do. Okay, so I'm pretending my hands are articulating two articulating bones at a joint, and the palms, the fleshy stuff, that's the cartilage. Okay, so that's going to compress. It's going to provide cushioning. It's going to provide some elasticity, some damping, also some cushioning. So let's say you press them really hard together, just really hard as you can. Isometric exercise. Be your own Hans and Franz. Pump you up. Okay, now try to slide them across each other. You notice that's incredibly difficult. It hurts. I don't want to injure my shoulder showing you how we protect our joints with a muscle contraction. But the point is that reduces the risk of a shear force damaging your joints, including your cartilage, ligaments, maybe even the tendons and muscles themselves. The trade-off is that, especially when you're lifting a heavy weight and you have a co-contraction of the antagonist and agonist muscles, it'll reduce the net torque. You won't be able to lift as much. Sometimes people will kind of slap themselves, use smelling salts, get really revved up. So the sympathetic system will turn off some of those protective mechanisms that will reduce co-contractions. One of those is the Golgi tendon organ reflex, for example. Okay, so agonist and antagonist muscles can act as a first-class lever. The joints in the middle, you have the antagonist on one side, the agonist on the other side. Notice that the forces are in the same general direction. They don't have to be perfectly parallel with each other, just in the same general direction. We have to have this not only for co-contractions, but because our muscles can only pull. My agonist muscles here, let's pretend this is elbow flexion. These muscles cannot produce elbow extension. At the molecular level, as we've said, actin and myosin, when they bind together, so this is my pair of myosin heads, when they bind to actin, there's built-in potential energy, because when we've taken them off a binding site, it takes ATP to do it. ATP stored in here, and then when you make contact, as you have enough calcium, which rolls tropomyosin off the binding site, that allows actin and myosin to be able to bind. And when they bind, they pull. They always pull. So that potential energy turns into kinetic energy. When we go into and talk about excitation, contraction, coupling, I think there's about 10 to 12 energy conversions. I'm going to actually, next time I go through it, I'm going to count this up. But there's about 10 to 12 energy conversions. I've gone through it a few times, and I'm going to probably put it down in stone, because I think it's really interesting about how we have lots of examples in biomechanics of energy conversion of one type to another, especially potential energy into kinetic energy. It's never a 100% conversion. If memory serves me correct, that's the second law of thermodynamics. That basically means you only get entropy every time you have some type of reaction. Second-class levers. Okay, here it gets really interesting, because just a few moments ago, we were talking about the plantar flexor muscles acting like a first-class lever, where the tibio-talar joint is the axis of rotation. But let's say you're doing something like, a toe raise exercise. There we go. Or climbing a set of stairs, or jumping for a rebound, or a spike in volleyball, or the high jump or the long jump, and you're producing plantar flexion. What's the lever system like now? Well, what's happened is as we do this, we move, we change our fulcrum. That's the magic trick that happens. So instead of the tibio-talar joint, when you're doing a toe raise or climbing a set of stairs or walking or running and pushing off, you now have a second class lever with a really long force arm and a shorter resistance arm. So the fulcrum on one side, the motive force on the other side, and the resistance, the weight of the body, and if you're running and walking, it's going to be actually considerably over the weight of the body, anywhere between 1.2 to 1.4, all the way to 2.5 to 3 times your body weight, sometimes even more. I remember at Penn State, they sometimes would record 3.5 times the body weight when someone was running pretty hard. So a second class lever is really a lot like a wheelbarrow. It's you basically have a motive force on one side, you've got that load in the middle, and you have the fulcrum. And that's exactly the situation we have with the plantar flexor muscles. The muscles are pulling up through the Achilles tendon. We have their body weight in the middle. We have the axis of rotation on the other end. A classic second class lever. Motive force, resistance. Notice these two forces are in opposite directions. That will always be the case with second and third class lever systems. Okay, so we've magically turned that into a third class lever system. Most lever systems of the body, however, are third class, whether it's elbow flexion, whether it's shoulder abduction, whether it is wrist motion. Most of these lever systems are third class levers. So they generally have a smaller force arm and then a substantially large resistance arm. In fact, the length of the resistance arm is always going to be greater than the length of the force arm. So if we resolve this muscle vector, it actually takes a fairly large rotary force to overcome a resistance. In fact, yeah, the magnitude of that resistance is going to be quite a bit smaller. There we go. And then the muscle force is going to be large indeed. So if you're lifting 30, 40, 50, maybe 100-pound weights, it may take you 300, 400, 500, 800 pounds, maybe even 1,000 pounds or more of muscle force to be able to do that. With knee extension especially, we're talking maybe half a ton, maybe a full ton of force by those quadriceps and gluteus maximus in terms of extending the hips and the knee joint. Okay, so we talked about mechanical advantage. It's basically the ratio of the force arm divided by the resistance arm. So in the case of some first-class levers, especially some tools, and second-class levers, where the force arm is greater than the resistance arm, the applied force needed to move an object is fairly small. You have a lot of leverage. Longer the lever arm for the force arm, the greater the amount of leverage. So crowbar, wrench, that's a really good example. Okay, there's sometimes a trade-off in biomechanics. Occasionally we can have our cake and eat it too, but in this case, it's a trade-off. So we get a lot of torque, but we sacrifice speed. In the case of the body, range of motion. Your plantar flexor muscles and your ankle joint can go through maybe about 90 degrees range of motion. So you can try that, and your ankle is probably more flexible than mine is. I'm doing some yoga with my wife, and I'm finding she's able to do some things with her ankle that I no longer can. It's kind of depressing because I used to be really flexible when I was young, and now it's like, this stuff won't move. So we're working on this. If you're ever caught between a rock and a hard place, that's a fulcrum. What you want to do with something like a crowbar is you want to maximize that force arm. Make it as long as possible, get yourself as much leverage as possible, minimize that resistance arm. The smaller, the shorter the resistance arm, the longer the force arm, the greater the leverage you have. And that means you can produce a lot of torque. And then for a small amount of force, maybe 50 pounds of force, you can move a rock that might weigh 1,000 pounds or more. So that's the really cool thing about mechanical advantage and maximizing torque and therefore your leverage. A lot of times though in the body, we have this situation where we have a small resistance arm I'm sorry, a large resistance arm and a small force arm. So the resistance arm is considerably greater than the force arm. So most muscle joint systems of the body look like this. The rotary force, the muscle force, is produced fairly close to the axis of rotation. The weight or outside resistance is a long distance from that axis of rotation. This is just a rule of thumb. It varies from individual to individual and joint to joint, muscle to muscle, etc. 1 to 8. So in other words, the resistance arm is 8 times longer than the force arm. So to lift a 20-pound weight, you're going to need at least 160 pounds of rotary force. To lift maybe 50 pounds, you'll need at least 100 pounds of rotary muscle force. And then because the angle of pull may be fairly acute, the amount of muscle force could be even larger than that, 500 pounds, 1,000 pounds, etc. Okay. So we're going to do a little problem, keeping in mind that ratio of the force arm divided by the resistance arm, mechanical advantage of 1 to 8. So let's say the resistance that I'm lifting is 20 pounds. I'm just going to ignore the weight of the body segment here as I'm trying to lift it. And I'm going to assume the rotary force is perpendicular to the lever. Made some assumptions, but I'm trying to make this as easy as possible. So let's say I have an isometric contraction. That means no net torque. The two torques are equal and opposite. So the torque produced by the dumbbell, by the resistance, is equal to the torque produced by the muscle. So what I'm going to try to do here is find the rotary portion of that muscle force. So I'm going to divide both sides by the force arm. So I'll be left with something like this. I'm going to have the resistance, which is 20 pounds, and I'm multiplying by the reciprocal of the mechanical advantage. So that has to be 8. So that's 20 times 8. That's 160 pounds of rotary force. But if I want to calculate, let's say that muscle force, that could be 300 pounds or more as I'm looking at this angle of pull, which appears to be about 42 degrees or something like that. Okay, so the question is, of course, now, all right, we have a lot of these third-class levers. They don't produce a lot of torque. What good are they? Why do we even have them? Quadriceps, all of these, for the most part, are going to be third-class lever systems. Okay, so, and we have a few first-class lever systems where the resistance arm is a lot greater than the force arm. So hip abductors in this particular type of exercise, if she was standing, actually would be a third-class lever system again. Okay, so what's the advantage? Well, again, speed, the need for speed, increased velocity when you're overcoming a light resistance. That's the key. So if you're trying to move your body weight or more, it's not so great. This is where we need a second-class lever. That's one of the reasons why when you're running, for example, or walking, that your plantar flexors are a second-class lever system because they're dealing with their body weight and more. And that's part of the reason that, because you got third-class lever systems for the quadriceps and the gluteus maximus and the hamstrings, it's one of the reasons why they're so large, because you're going to need huge forces to deal with the forces that you see when people are running, particularly playing sports, and even to a lesser extent walking. So you're dealing with huge forces. You can either overcome them with mass, large muscles, and most people's calf muscles aren't really small, but you have the advantage of having second-class levers, and you're going to need them. So that's why that lower extremity below the knee and its design or adaptation, if you will, is so incredibly important. And this is part of it right here. We're generating these large muscle forces. So you might be thinking, well, that's not an advantage. What good is that? Well, it means a few things. If we resolve this muscle vector, we're going to have a fairly large stabilizing component, right? That's good. If this dumbbell is fairly light, 20 pounds is, maybe 8 to 10, depending upon your size, 6 to 8 to 10%, maybe 12% of your body weight, maybe a bit more than that. Let me think about this a second. More like 8% to about 10 to 12 to 15% of your body weight. But the point is, it's a small percentage of your body weight. It's going to be something that's going to feel heavy because you have this really long resistance arm and it's producing a lot of torque. The fact it's 20 pounds isn't that big a deal, It's the fact it's 20 pounds and it's held far away from an axis of rotation. That's what the big deal is. And then you have these muscles attached very close to the joints or axes of rotation. So one of the clues is going to be stability. We've talked about potential speed. So we're going to talk about that in a second. So here's another reason why we don't have a lot of second-class levers. Again, they would limit range of motion. One of the reasons that this would be the case has to do with the way skeletal muscle is structured and the overlap between the actin filaments, those are the thin filaments, and then the myosin filaments and heads. So if we went through, let's say, a large range of motion with a second-class lever. So let's say I'm the best surgeon in the world, and I'm going to make this person Superman or some type of superhero. And I move this tendon for the biceps brachii down on the wrist. And I'm like, yes, I've really scored here because I've maximized that force arm. I'm going to make it really large. My new superhero is going to be able to lift thousands of pounds because I know muscles can produce thousands of pounds of force. However, the thing that I forgot when I was looking at Aldous Huxley's work, etc., and cross-bridge cycling is that muscles only can shorten a limited amount, 30, 40%. 40% is about as much shortening as you can have. So what tends to happen as the muscles shorten more and more, or if they super lengthen, is that the ability of myosin heads to bind to actin gets interfered with. So you have fewer binding sites. When muscles shorten, you have some overcrowding and sliding of actin filaments, and then the myosin's not in optimal position. It's overlapping with parts of actin that don't have those binding sites. And it's all about cross bridges. The more cross bridges you can produce between actin and myosin, the greater the amount of force the muscle can produce. So we're going to do a simple exercise. I think we've done it another time or two in the class, really simple one. So take a pen or a pencil, some type of an object, and we're going to keep our wrist at a neutral position, the anatomical neutral position, 180 degrees. And I'm going to exercise or use my finger flexors and squeeze as hard as I can. I'm probably not going to be able to pull that out. I can pull the top out, but I'm probably not going to be able to pull the pen out if I squeeze really hard. So I can produce a lot of force, a lot of torque this way. But if I shorten the muscle, and these are the muscles that produce finger flexion, they're right here. When you do this, you can feel them. So if I shorten these muscles and I basically overcrowd the binding sites between actin and myosin, I'm overlapping some actin. I don't have as many binding sites, so I won't be able to produce as much force if you do that. And then, oh, that kind of hurts. And then you try to squeeze. You can't produce as much force, even though you can produce lots and lots of effort. So these optimal binding sites, they start to disappear, and we just can't connect as much of these myosin heads to actin. So darn, it didn't work. The good news is that over the first 20 degrees range of motion between full extension right here, man, you could be a superhero. But over the rest of the range of motion, you're a weakling. You would be like spaghetti. So again, muscles only have a limited ability to shorten. So when we do this, the finger flexor muscles are on this part of the curve where they can't produce as much force and as much tension. Most of the time, we're reaching to the end of the range of motion about right here. I think with the wrist, you can overextend or overextend a bit and probably can't produce as much force. You'll be on this part of the curve, but that's a little bit unusual. So most of the time, it's too much muscle shortening. Okay, so it means that our ability to be able to basically construct a lot of second-class levers, especially where we have a large freedom of movement of a joint, that's not going to work. Darn it. Okay. But what we want, again, it's a trade-off. We want to look at the good things. So we can't produce as much torque. We can't shorten the muscle enough. But what advantages we do have if we're using a racket or throwing a softball or a baseball is that the longer the resistance arm, and if you're holding a racket or a golf club, you're actually increasing the length of the resistance arm. So the longer the racket, the longer the club, the longer the resistance arm. So, and we're usually hitting or moving an object that's fairly small in mass. It's usually not very large. Tennis ball doesn't have a lot of mass, neither does a softball or baseball or a golf ball. They're relatively light. So what we're doing is maximizing the radius of a circle, whether it's elbow flexion, knee extension, hip abduction, whatever it happens to be, as we rotate the joint, if we follow the hand, or in this case, the tennis racket, rotating on the outside of that circle, what we're seeing is we're maximizing the arc length. So if we can increase the arc length by increasing the radius, that means the velocity is going to increase. So this tennis racket's always going to travel faster than someone's hand versus someone's elbow, especially versus someone's shoulder. As you move out that kinematic chain, you get faster and faster movement. That's that whip-like motion that we talked about. You're not going to be able to break the sound barrier, unfortunately, but you're going to be able to maximize that. So this is right now the only punter who's in the NFL Hall of Fame. This is Ray Guy. We think probably in the near future, maybe in 2 to 3 years, Shane Leckler, former Aggie and also an Oakland Raiders punter. I think he also punted for the Houston Texans for a while. He's probably going to be the second NFL punter in the Hall of Fame. So Ray Guy, I remember him from way back in the 1970s. He was from southern Mississippi, had these really long legs, very short torso, kind of ideal in terms of punting. I think he was the first NFL punter to average over 40 yards a punt. So he's got these really long legs, long radius. Here's my little short legs. That's a big disadvantage in terms of arc length. So for a given arc that's covered, because I have shorter legs versus Ray Guy, I can't cover the same arc length. And arc length is a distance divided by time. That's velocity. So that is a huge advantage. Ray Guy also was incredibly flexible. Look at that range of motion. So if he can go through a larger arc for a given amount of time and a greater radius, those are all the ingredients he needs to be able to generate high foot speed and to be able to kick it 50, 60, 70 yards. So he was one of the folks that had really good range, but he usually putted it really high so that the coverage got downfield and were able to make tackles. So that was one there. I've seen some punters that can punt farther than Ray Guy, but he was perfect in terms of kicking into or with his coverage so that the opponents didn't return the ball very far. Okay, so with third-class levers, advantages we have: range of motion, speed at the distal end of a limb or body segment or club. The longer the golf club is, the longer the resistance arm, and therefore the longer the radius of the circle, the greater the arc length, the greater the speed, club head speed. The third advantage is stability. And we've already talked about the fact that these muscles are producing large forces. That means you have a stabilizing force that's pretty large. Here's another kind of linked advantage: third-class levers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take advantage of static mechanics. And I'm going to pretend that I have a situation where I have an isometric contraction, meaning the torque produced by the resistance is exactly the same in magnitude and opposite in direction as the torque I'm trying to produce with my agonist muscles to complete the lift. So we've got this battle. This battle is going to be a tie. The sum of the torques, or net torque, is equal to 0. And with static mechanics, one of the rules is the sum of the forces in any given direction. It's not overall per se, but in any given direction should be equal to 0. So I'm going to make it simple and make it vertical. So remember, I'm lifting that 20-pound weight. Because I had the mechanical advantage of 1 to 8, it took 160 pounds of rotary force to do that. And then we kind of estimated maybe pretty close to 300 pounds, 250 to 300 pounds of muscle force to lift that 20-pound weight. It's kind of depressing if you think about it. Lifting a 20-pound weight, it's going to take 300 plus pounds of muscle force to do that. But here's the advantage, is you're protecting your joints and you're able to do lots of work. So unfortunately, we've got those farmer genes in us as well as the hunter-gatherer genes. Our ancestors had to do a lot of work to go get some food. They would just go into HEB and spend an hour there or 45 minutes, get our groceries and then leave. Or today we can just order them on our phone or preferably on the computer, just drive and punch something in my smartphone and then they'll come out and give the groceries to me. Either way, regardless of how we get our food, we don't have to do the same type of labor that our ancestor did back in the day. So exercise and getting nutrition, food, are actually linked. That's actually the stimulus. That's what makes it so difficult in today's society to convince people to stay active, to exercise, etc. Because we generally have pretty good access to food. We still have people and children, unfortunately, who have issues getting enough food or getting the right type of food. So we still have a lot to do there. But the point is that our bodies are kind of bioengineered and adapted to be able to do lots of physical activity. And for the most part, try to maintain our joints and muscles and bones in relatively good shape. The good news is today that orthopedic surgery and rehabilitation is so much better. Sometimes people think about going back, or I wish I could live like 30 years ago or 20 years ago. Things were better back then, music's better or whatever. I wouldn't do it at all. I would not take that bet. Well, if they gave me enough money and I could store that money here and then come back from the 80s safely, then I might do that. But that's about the only way I would do it. Because before about 1985 and really good arthroscopic surgery and modern, as opposed to cave dwelling orthopedics and sports medicine, if you hurt yourself, you can be crippled for life, unfortunately. Knee injuries, they used to cast and then operate, then cast again. And then we wonder why those folks are getting knee replacements, where they have osteoarthritis, etc. Okay, so the point is your body is trying to protect you at all times. Like they say in boxing or MMA, protect yourself at all times, right? Your body's protecting you at all times. So this is part of the stability. Okay, so again, static mechanics, some of the torque is equal to 0. Some of the forces in the y direction is equal to 0. We got 20 pounds down. And again, it took 160 pounds of rotary force just to maintain an isometric contraction going up. Okay, so we got a problem. Some of the forces in the y direction are not equal to 0. Where's the rest of them? Where they're going to form a joint reaction force between the humerus and basically the elbow. So at the joint, it's going to be pressed together. So this is another mechanism of joint protection. And a lot of joint protection is, again, producing nice compressive forces. It works really well with co-contractions. That way, there's not a tendency to slip as much. Co-contractions work great. They do limit the amount of net torque you can produce while you're lifting an object, but they do protect joints and bones. So protect yourself at all times. Really good way to think about the human body and the secret of human movement. Yes, it's really important to be able to perform well, to be able to produce lots of torque, to be able to do cool stuff. And there are ways to have your cake and eat it too. Resistive training, exercise training can help to maximize the ability of your muscles and joint systems to perform ideally. Okay, so with that, I'm going to wish you guys a good day. We're going to come back with another lecture, possibly two, but I think a lecture focusing on more applications relating to torque, especially related to our joints, and a few details about how this system works. Okay, y'all have a good one. We are going to see you really soon. Stay safe.